Hello once again, this is Jonathan Miller with the Hometown Historian channel. Today we are at the Pennsylvania historical marker for Reed's Fort. We're here along Route 22, so it is going to be a little loud when vehicles go by. There really is not a ton to talk about here because there really is not a whole lot of information. So I am going to talk a little bit more about the distinction between forts and sanctuaries and those types of structures. But I'll talk about this as well here. Reed's Fort, just south of this point, stood the house of Adam Reed, Esquire. In 1755, it was turned into a fort. Here, with rangers from Hanover Township, Reed protected the people of the countryside against Indian raids. So we're going to quick walk over here a little further off the road. Obviously, Reed's Fort no longer exists. Most of the French and Indian forts no longer exist. We visited in the past the site of the Fort Swatara monument, and at some point I want to take you to Light's Fort in Lebanon and to Fort Zeller, which is between Newmanstown and Richland in Lebanon County. Those are two of some of the last existing French and Indian war forts, which there is some, I guess, I don't want to say controversy, but like sort of discussion between which of the forts, Light's Fort or Zeller's Fort, which one is actually older. Some say the one, some say the other. I believe from what I was talking to Cliff, it sounds like Light's Fort in Lebanon is just slightly older of a building. But I want to talk about some of the distinctions. We did the Blue Mountain Fort historical marker, and I just found this blog that I've come across. I gotta get off the top of my head, I can't think of her name, but she does this whole series that she's been doing it for years now, that she goes around all over Pennsylvania and takes a picture of the historical marker, and then actually does quite a bit more research, because I'm going to be going down the road here on 22 and going and hitting the old Hanover Presbyterian Church sign, and also hit on my way back to Hanover Resolves. I got all my research from her, so I do want to credit her for that. And then I'll actually be putting a link on the Hanover Resolves Pennsylvania historical marker. So it's a cool site to check out, and a lot of information. She does a ton of research, and that's going to be extraordinarily helpful for me with doing these, because sometimes it's very hard. Like with Reed's Fort, there just is not a whole lot. Now, she talked about in her blog, she did one on the Blue Mountains Fort, and talked about, they talk about the different forts in the area from the Susquehanna over to the Swatty, and they talked about the Paxton Rangers were highly involved in these different forts. Now, she had put Fort Manada, Fort Swatara, and then there was two more of the forts, I believe, she put in to that are over more towards the Susquehanna, which I believe in that case she probably isn't quite correct on that, because the ones they're talking about were log fortresses like Reed's Fort, which I think that's one of them that they're actually talking about, which is in like the 60s, towards the end of the French and Indian War, whereas Fort Swatara and Fort Manada were actually forts that were in the mid-50s that were built, and they only operated for maybe 2 or 3 years during that time. And Fort Indiantown Gap, I believe, was also somewhat similar. That was when you had the first part of the French and Indian War where there were a lot of attacks, and that was primarily Manada Gap, Swatara Gap, and Indiantown Gap. Now, the later ones, I think they still had some attacks there, so those forts were still there, but a lot of times they were using, like, to differentiate between forts and sanctuaries. For instance, in Myerstown, I just did a video on the Isaac Meyer homestead. That's commonly referred to as the Old Fort. Even though it was never actually officially known as a fort, it did serve that purpose. I don't think Militia ever stayed there, but it was considered like a sanctuary. And that's a lot of these places, like the churches. We've done Monroe Valley Chapel, which was a Moravian mission, but also served as a sanctuary in the community, as well as Bethel Moravian Church in Lickdale region. Those were, Hill Lutheran Church would be another good example, that these were quite imposing structures, and they served as sanctuaries for the local communities, because they were large structures that people came together and they'd be able to defend themselves. Now, one of the other things they talk about, there's a group of militia that came from the Hanover region, or Hanover Township, which is maybe about 4 or 5 miles down the road here, because that's where we're going to go to this Old Hanover Presbyterian Church, which that's the very first video I did for the channel was with Cliff, the Wandering Woodsman, at that churchyard. Church no longer exists there, but the churchyard obviously still exists. We did the video there from Revolutionary War period. I think it was 1720s. But they came from there. But there's also the Paxton Rangers, and if you're familiar with Cliff's videos, he did a video on the Paxton boys who committed the massacres with the Conestoga Indians. Twice they had 2 different massacres. One, they went to the village where these Native Americans were. Now, most of them were away, so they only killed some of them, but they eventually committed a second massacre because they were holding the rest of the Conestoga Indians, the survivors. They were holding them in the Lancaster County Jail for their protection, and unfortunately these guys showed up, the Paxton boys, and they murdered pretty much the rest of them. There's controversy on whether a couple of them survived or got away or not, whether that's true or not, but they killed the vast majority. And the Conestoga Indians were, I think it was only like a tribe of maybe like 28 people. It wasn't that many. Most of them were old men and children, or old people and children, and they actually had become Christians, and they dressed much like the settlers. But we talked about in the French and Indian War, and a lot of these wars, a lot of times the people that get hurt are the innocents, and a lot of times it has to do with sort of redirecting your anger, because the Paxton boys had legitimate reasons for anger because of the Quakers not really putting a whole lot of emphasis on having militia and protecting the citizens, which is a lot of what caused these issues in the French and Indian War. Unfortunately, the Paxton boys obviously went about it wrong, and then the Native American tribes that attacked the settlers. A lot of times those settlers were very peaceable with the local tribes, whether it was Lenape, the Susquehannock, to a degree. They were, I believe, part of the Iroquois nation. A lot of the locals, they didn't have problems. It was just other groups came in and it just attacked the innocents and did some really horrible things, and vice versa. The same thing happened, like for instance with the Paxton boys. Now the Paxton Rangers did go in between a lot of these older forts, which would have been like Fort Swatara, Fort Banda, those types of ones, over to the Susquehanna, to the Swatara. Now there is some crossover between them. From the research that this lady that I've started using as a source, she had said that particularly, I believe, one individual, I forget what the name is, but he was involved with both. And so there was, even though John Elder, the guy that sort of in a way had a lot of responsibility with egging them on, he condemned the attacks. But so there's some of these guys that were militia were also involved with some of the massacres and some of the bad things that happened. But I wanted to just talk about a little bit to differentiate between some of these things that were actually called forts. A lot of them were former homes, so these were not terribly imposing structures, but they could hold 15 to 20, maybe 25 militia. And that was another major part of considering something a fort. The places that were more sanctuaries didn't have active militia in them, and they usually spaced these forts maybe 5 to 10 miles in between them. So for 15 to 20 guys, 25 at most, to take care of, say, a 10-mile square area was asking a lot. Mainly, more than anything, they were there to defend, but they were also there because they were going around and watching that they would basically, in essence, be forewarning everybody that, hey, an attack's coming, with a band of warriors is coming in, and then the people would go to these different sanctuaries that they had available to them to be able to protect themselves, because that's basically what it came down to. But every single one of these forts, like Reed's Fort, there was also one, I believe, on Harper's Tavern called Harper's Fort. Whether that was actually Adam Harper's original tavern or his home, there's some discrepancies on that. But once again, that was one of those things. Reed's Fort was actually considered a fort. Harper's Fort, not as much. That was more like Isaac Meyer's homestead, where it was called the Old Fort by the locals, but it wasn't. And there was another fort there as well in Myerstown. Neither one of them was considered a fort. It was more a particularly strong home that worked as a sanctuary. So with that, we're going to head down to the next historical marker. I'm going to try to get 2 more of those, maybe some more, and then we're going to do a road trip over Goldmine Mountain. So I wanted to give a little more information on these forts, because they really are pretty extraordinary places. And I do want to visit Light's Fort, which is still standing. It's not complete anymore. Part of the one side had been removed, and Zeller's Fort is still in pretty much its original state. So that's a pretty neat place to visit, and we'll visit those so you can get a better idea of what the vast majority of what these forts actually look like. So thanks everybody, and we will see you in a bit. And we'll see you about town. Thanks everybody.